Adventures of Harry Nile.
The rain in Seattle doesn't wash away sins, it just makes them slippery. It was raining hard tonight, beating against the frosted glass of my office door like a desperate man trying to get inside. I sat in the dark, watching the water track down the pane. Just me, a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon, and the neon sign from the hotel across the street blinking in red. It flashed like a warning. I ignored it. I slid a glass across the desk and poured a drink. It tasted like Tuesday, bitter, cheap, and a long way from the weekend. I set the bottle down and looked at the recording machine. I don't know why I dictate these files. Maybe I just like the sound of my own voice when the city gets this quiet. Makes me wonder who exactly is listening to these tapes out there in the dark. Where are you tuning from now? What time does the clock show on your end of the line? Drop it in the comments below. Makes a guy feel a little less alone in this damp gray town. I tossed the drink back. It burned, but it was a familiar burn. Then the doorknob rattled. "You Harry Nile?" a voice called out. It sounded like cracked ice. "That's what the painted letters on the glass say," I told her, "unless the storm washed them off." She entered and shoved the door behind her. She was early 30s, all sharp angles and tight lines. She wore a trench coat that had seen better days, and a hat that tried too hard to look stylish. The air in the room shifted immediately, a mix of cheap drugstore perfume and the sharp sting of expensive gin. It was a combination that usually meant trouble, the expensive kind of trouble. "I need a private investigator," she said. "You found one," I replied. "Take a seat, but don't expect a plush cushion." She sat in the wooden chair opposite my desk. She didn't relax. She sat rigid, gripping her handbag with knuckles that were turning white under the dim office bulb. "My name is Evelyn Doyle," she said. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Doyle. What brings you out in this downpour?" "My husband is dead, Mr. Nile." She didn't blink. No weeping, no shaking shoulders. Just a flat statement of fact, like she was reading the morning weather report. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. I kept my tone neutral. "Don't be," she fired back. "Artie and I haven't been happy for a long time. We were separated, living apart." "So why are you here?" I asked. "Artie was a cab driver," she explained. "Worked for Emerald City Cabs. They found him last night, parked out at Pier 70. "Pier 70 is a dead end," I said. "Nothing out there but rotten wood and seagulls." "Exactly," Evelyn said. "He was dead in the front seat. The police called me this morning." I pulled a cigarette from my coat pocket, tapped it on the desk. "And you want me to find out who did it?" "No," she said. "I want you to prove someone did it." I paused, the unlit cigarette resting in my fingers. "Run that by me again." "The police are calling it a suicide," she said. "They say he drove out there, parked the cab and shot himself. One bullet, right in the chest." "Did they find the gun?" I asked. "No," she replied. "Hard to shoot yourself and then throw the weapon into the bay," I pointed out. "The police think it fell out of the window or some drifter walked by and stole it after the fact," she said. Her voice dripped with heavy contempt. "They don't care. He was just a cabbie with a gambling habit and a pile of debts. To them, suicide makes sense. Case shut." I struck a match. The flame flared, pushing back the shadows in the small office. I lit the cigarette and took a drag. Smoke billowed toward the stained ceiling tiles. "Maybe the cops are right," I said. "Gambling debts can make a man do desperate things. A bullet is a cheap way out." Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes locked onto mine. "Artie was a coward, Mr. Nile. He wouldn't shoot himself. He'd run, he'd hide, but he wouldn't pull a trigger. Not on himself." "You seem very sure of that." "I was married to him for 6 years. I know what he was." "And what was he?" "A hustler," she said flatly. "A low-level bookie who thought he was smarter than the house. He drove a cab to pay the rent, but he was always working an angle, always looking for the quick buck." I leaned back in my chair. The springs squeaked in loud protest. "Let's lay the cards on the table, Mrs. Doyle. You didn't come out in a storm like this just to clear Artie's good name. You said you were separated. You don't strike me as a grieving widow looking for emotional closure. So what's the real angle?" She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that cost a man a week's wages just to look at. and a lifetime of regret to touch. Pragmatic, cold. Artie had a life insurance policy, she said softly. $5,000. That is a lot of money. It is when you owe 3,000 of it to people who don't take kindly to late payments, she shot back. Your own gambling debts, I guessed. She didn't answer directly. She just opened her handbag and pulled out a silver compact. She checked her reflection in the small mirror, then snapped it firmly shut. I have obligations, Mr. Nile. The insurance company won't pay out on a suicide. There is a specific clause. If he killed himself, the policy is void. I get nothing. But if it's murder, I get the 5,000. I pay off my obligations. I buy a train ticket out of this damp, miserable city, and I never look back. You want me to prove he was murdered. I am paying you to prove he was murdered, she corrected me. I don't care who did it. I don't care why they did it. I just need the police to change the official report from suicide to homicide. The insurance company will follow the police report. I took another drag of my cigarette. The smoke tasted like stale tobacco and bad decisions. $5,000 was a fortune, and Evelyn Doyle was a woman who would step over a dead body to get to it. Fact was, she already was. The police don't like private eyes poking around their closed cases, I told her. Especially not cases they've neatly wrapped up with a bow. I thought you needed the work, she said, looking around my bare office. Her eyes took in the peeling paint, the dusty file cabinets, the half-empty bottle of bourbon. She wasn't wrong. The rent was late, and my tab at the diner downstairs was getting dangerously long. I need the work, I admitted. But taking on the 3rd precinct is a good way to lose my license, or my teeth. She reached into her handbag again. This time she didn't pull out a compact. She pulled a small stack of bills. She separated 2 crisp $20 bills and a 10. She slid them across the scarred wood of my desk. George Washington stared up at me from the paper, looking just as disappointed in my life choices as my mother used to be. $50, Evelyn said, for a retainer. You get another 50 when you bring me a police report that says homicide. I looked at the money. $50 would pay the rent. It would buy a lot of cheap bourbon, keep the lights on for another month, and maybe buy a few of those imported cigars the desk sergeant down at the precinct favored. It was enough to make a man ignore his better judgment. And my better judgment had been asleep at the wheel for years anyway. What else can you tell me about his routine? I asked, pulling a fresh yellow notepad from the desk drawer and clicking my pen. Nothing, she said, standing up and smoothing the wrinkles out of her trench coat. I haven't spoken to Artie in 3 weeks. Police said they found his cab at Pier 70 just before midnight. He worked the night shift, Emerald City cabs, like I said. The rest is what I am paying you to figure out. She turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floorboards, a hard rhythmic sound that echoed in the empty room. I'll start at the precinct in the morning, I told her back. See if I can pry the official incident report loose from the desk sergeant. Don't wait too long, Mr. Nile, she said, resting her gloved hand on the doorknob. The insurance company is already processing the paperwork. Just get me that paper saying it was murder. She pushed the door open. The sound of the street traffic and rushing water flooded into the room. She entered the dark hallway without looking back. She pulled the door firmly shut until the latch clicked. I sat there in silence. The $50 retainer lay flat on the desk. The room still smelled heavily of expensive gin and raw desperation. Morning in Seattle was just a lighter shade of gray. The storm from the night before hadn't quit. It had only changed its attitude, settling into a steady, freezing drizzle that soaked right through to your undershirt. I walked the 4 blocks from my office to the 3rd precinct with my coat collar turned up against the chill, sidestepping deep puddles that looked like black mirrors on the asphalt. The inside of the 3rd precinct hit you like a physical wall. It always smelled exactly the same, a heavy, suffocating blend of stale coffee boiling over on a corner hot plate, the wet wool of heavy uniform coats drying on wooden radiators, and the sharp chemical tang of cheap floor wax. It was a smell that got into the fibers of your suit and stayed there for days, reminding you exactly what kind of city you lived in. The bullpen was a noisy mess of ringing rotary phones, the aggressive clatter of heavy typewriter keys, and the hollow echo of tired men wearing heavy leather boots walking across worn linoleum. Over in the holding cage, a drunk in a torn suit was loudly trying to remember the words to an old Navy tune. failing miserably on every third line. I bypassed the chaos and headed straight for the high wooden desk at the front. Sitting behind it, looking like a man who was carrying the entire concrete building on his shoulders, was Sergeant Roy McAllister. Everyone just called him Mac. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with a face that resembled a tired bulldog and deep bags under his eyes that spoke of too many night shifts and not enough pension. Mac was currently rubbing his thick knuckles over his right knee, his face twisted in a quiet grimace. "Morning, Mac," I said, leaning my elbows on the high wooden counter. He didn't look up right away. He just kept massaging the joint, his breathing slow and heavy. "Nothing good about it, Nile," he replied. His voice was a slow, methodical drawl, like molasses pouring out of a cold jar. "This blasted damp, it doesn't just sit on your skin, it sinks right into the bone. My knees have been predicting this storm since Tuesday. Swear to heaven, I need to retire and move to a desert, somewhere with sand and zero humidity." "I hear Arizona is nice this time of year," I said. "Anywhere is better than this swamp," Mac grumbled. He finally looked up, his tired eyes narrowing as he took me in. "What do you want, Harry? You don't come in here just to check on my arthritis." I reached into the inner pocket of my damp coat and pulled out a long, dark cigar. The band was fancy, gold and red, imported. I rested it gently on the edge of the police blotter. Mac's eyes shifted from my face to the cigar, and then back again. The grimace on his face softened, just a fraction. He didn't reach for it yet. He knew how the game was played. "Arthur Doyle," I said quietly, keeping my voice under the ambient noise of the busy precinct. "Cabbie for Emerald City. Found him parked out at Pier 70 last night." Mac let out a long, heavy sigh. His thick hand reached out, moving with deliberate slowness, and palmed the cigar. It vanished into his uniform shirt pocket in one smooth motion. "I should have known," he drawled. "Whenever a corpse turns up with no answers, your shadow falls across my desk. Who's paying you?" "A grieving widow," I lied smoothly. "Right, and I'm the mayor of Seattle," Mac muttered. He heavily pushed himself up from his stool, walked over to a bank of green metal filing cabinets, and yanked open the top drawer. The metal squealed in protest. He pulled out a thin manila folder and lumbered back to the desk, dropping it flat in front of me. He rested his hand on it. "I can't let you read the official report, Harry. It's against regulations," Mac said, his slow drawl heavy with practiced authority. "I know the rules, Mac. Just read me the highlights." He flipped the folder open. "Call came in at 11:45 last night. Harbor Patrol was doing a routine sweep of the abandoned docks past Pier 70. Found the Emerald City taxicab sitting out there in the dark. Arthur Doyle was dead in the front seat. One gunshot wound, right square in the center of the chest. Blood was already drying." "Where's the weapon?" I asked. Mac shook his heavy head. "Nowhere. Patrol boys searched the car, searched the pier, even dragged a magnet through the shallow water near the dock piling. Nothing. No gun, no shell casing." "So it's a homicide," I said. "Officially, no." Mac tapped a thick finger on the paper. "The captain upstairs is stamping this as suicide, slapping a neat little bow on it and sending it to the archives." "A suicide with a missing gun?" I let out a short, cynical laugh. "That's quite a magic trick. Guy shoots himself, rolls down the window, and tosses the revolver into the Puget Sound before he bleeds out." "I don't write the reports, Harry," Mac said, his tone defensive. "The captain says Doyle was a degenerate gambler drowning in debt. Guy drove his cab to the water's edge, got cold feet, and finally did the deed. Some opportunistic dock rat probably walked by 20 minutes later, saw a dead man, and swiped the piece out of his lap to pawn it. Case closed." "That is the flimsiest theory I've heard all year, Mac." "It clears a case off the board," Mac countered, leaning closer. "Look, the murder boys know it stinks. They went over the cab thoroughly before they towed it." "Anything interesting?" Mac flipped a page in the file. Keys were missing from the ignition, but the switch was left turned to the on position, and the taximeter was still engaged. It was running when they found him. It just stopped ticking when the engine finally died. "The engine died?" "The gas tank was bone dry," Mac explained, squinting at the typed report. "Must have just sat there idling until it burned through the tank. The weird part is the fare meter. It stopped at $12.50. I didn't say anything, but my mind snapped to attention. A $12.50 fare in this city was massive. A thought flickered in the back of my brain, sharp and uninvited, a quiet alarm bell ringing in the damp air. But I kept my face totally blank. I wasn't paid to help the police do math. Any solid suspects? I asked, shifting the conversation. If the homicide boys know it's not a suicide, who do they like for the hit? Mac lowered his voice, leaning his heavy frame over the counter. Vice Squad had a file on Doyle. He was deep in the hole to Leo Rossi. You know Fingers Rossi? Operates that loan shark ring out of the basement in Pioneer Square. I know him, I said. Doyle owed Rossi $500, Mac drawled. Missed 3 payments. Detectives figure Rossi finally got tired of waiting, had one of his thugs take a ride in Doyle's cab, put a bullet in his ribs, and dumped the car at the pier to send a message. But Rossi is smart. No witnesses, no weapon. Without a gun, the captain won't authorize a warrant to drag Rossi in. So, suicide it remains. I need to see that cab, Mac. It's locked up in the city impound yard on 4th Avenue, he replied. No unauthorized personnel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a second Cuban cigar. I laid it exactly where the first one had been. Mac stared at it. He let out a long, rumbling sigh that rattled deep in his chest. You're going to get me fired one of these days, Nile, or thrown in that holding cell over there. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a small pink carbon slip, and scribbled a signature at the bottom. He tore it off the pad and slid it across the blotter, scooping up the second cigar in the same heavy motion. I folded the pink impound slip and tucked it securely into my inside pocket. I traded the cigar for a clear look at the board. The cops liked Leo Rossi for the hit, and it made a twisted kind of sense on paper. Rossi had the temper, muscle, and drive. Take care of those knees, Mac, I said, turning away from the desk. Stay out of trouble, Harry, he shouted behind me, already unwrapping the cigar. And if you bump into Rossi, don't let him shake your hand. Pioneer Square was a gray tomb carved from wet brick and forgotten promises. The rain followed me down the steps, pooling on the concrete landing outside the basement door like grease on a greasy spoon. A crude painted sign on the frosted glass read Pacific Mercantile Company. But nobody had bought or sold a dry good in that cellar since the Depression. I gave the heavy wood door 3 sharp raps with my knuckles. Inside, something heavy scraped across the floorboards. A deadbolt threw itself back with a loud metallic clatter. The door opened 4 inches, revealing a strip of yellow light and a wide, flat nose. The man behind the crack was named Frankie. He didn't have a neck. His skull just tapered straight down into a broad pair of shoulders wrapped in a cheap brown suit. He looked at me, then looked at the rain falling off the brim of my hat. The place is closed, Nile, Frankie grunted, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed under a heavy boot. Go find a dry doorway. I'm not looking to buy, Frankie, I said, wedging the toe of my shoe against the bottom threshold before he could slam the door in my face. Just looking to pay my respects. Respects aren't open for business today. Tell Leo the first M here. I think he'll want to talk about Artie Doyle. Frankie's eyes narrowed. He stared at me for 3 long seconds, weighing whether it was worth the effort to break my nose in the hallway or let me freeze inside. He stepped back and yanked the door open. Get in before you flood the rug. I stepped through. The air hit me like a hot, damp blanket. It smelled like cheap Turkish tobacco, bay rum, and the wet floor of a laundry room. The office was windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb hanging from a frayed cord over a scarred oak desk. Sitting behind that desk, filing his fingernails with a small silver pocket knife, was Leo Fingers Rossi. Rossi was 40, sharp-dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my annual rent, with slicked-back dark hair and eyes as cold and empty as 2 holes punched in a tin roof. He didn't look up from his nails right away. He just let the silence stretch out, letting the rhythmic scrape of steel on keratin fill the room. Harry Nile, Rossi said softly, not looking up. The city's favorite cheap gumshoe. I hear you're walking around asking questions about a dead cab driver. Word travels fast in this town, I said, walking over to 2 empty wooden chairs facing his desk. I didn't wait for an invitation. I pulled one out and sat down, resting my hands on my knees. Especially when the cops are looking at a stack of unpaid tabs. Rossi stopped filing. He snapped the pocket knife shut with a sharp click, laid it on the blotter, and finally raised his dark eyes to mine. A slow, thin smile touched the corners of his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. The cops think I had something to do with Artie Doyle taking a permanent dirt nap, Rossi said, his voice smooth and easy, like a lounge singer laying out a bad bet. Is that what you're here for, Harry? To read me my rights? I don't carry a badge, Leo. You know that. Badges cost too much in laundry bills. Then why are you standing in my basement? Artie owed you $500, I said, keeping my tone flat. That's a lot of money to lose on a bookie's ledger. Cops are saying you sent Frankie here, or one of the other thugs, to collect the hard way. 1 bullet in the ribs. Park the cab at Pier 70. Call it a night. Rossi let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning under his weight. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a gold cigarette case, popped it open, and slid a cigarette between his lips. Frankie moved instantly, stepping up with a silver lighter to catch the flame. Rossi took a long drag, squinting through the blue haze. The cops are idiots, Harry. And you should know better than to buy what they're selling, Rossi said, blowing a stream of smoke toward the ceiling bulb. Artie Doyle was a pest, a mosquito buzzing around my ear. Sure, he was 500, but dead men don't pay debts. You kill a guy, you write off the cash. I'm running a lending office, Nile, not a charity morgue. Sometimes a message is worth more than $500, I countered. Keep the rest of the debtors in line. Artie wasn't important enough to send a message to, Rossi shot back, his voice hardening just a fraction. The guy was small. He barely made enough driving that hack to cover his gas, let alone clear his tab. If I wanted to lean on him, I'd have broken a thumb or two. Make him drive with one hand. You put a bullet in a guy's chest, you draw heat from the 3rd precinct. You think I want homicide crawling up my backside every time a hack driver finds a hole in his coat? I watched him closely. His pulse didn't jump, his hands were steady. Loan sharks like Rossi didn't scare easily, but they also didn't usually commit murder over small change, unless their pride was on the line, and Rossi didn't strike me as a guy whose pride was wrapped up in Artie Doyle. You talked to him recently? I asked. 2 nights ago, Rossi said. Right here in this room. Artie came crawling in, shaking like a wet cat, begging for another week on the interest. I told him no. I told him he had until Friday to cough up at least 200 or I'd start taking pieces of his cab. How did he react? He didn't pull a gun. He didn't threaten me, Rossi said, taking another drag. He just smiled, a weird greasy kind of smile. Told me he wouldn't need to worry about the tab by Friday. Said he had a new arrangement, a big score coming through. I kept my face neutral. Did he say who? No, Rossi muttered. Artie wasn't smart enough to share his angles unless he was trying to borrow them. But whatever it was, he looked confident, like a guy who thought he just drew a royal flush. And you let him walk out of here? Why wouldn't I? Rossi spread his hands. If he had a cash flow coming in, killing him would be bad business. I watched him walk out that door, head up, coat buttoned against the rain. That was the last time I saw him alive. I pulled a cigarette from my own pocket, tapped it against my thumb, and struck a match. The sulfur smell mixed with the heavy smoke in the room. I took my time lighting it, watching Rossi through the gray haze. The police report says the cab was found at Pier 70, with the motor burned out and the meter running, I said. Rossi's eyebrows ticked upward, just a millimeter. Is that a fact? That's a fact. Well, Artie always was a terrible driver, Rossi said smoothly. Maybe he got lost in the fog. People don't usually drive 2 miles past the end of the paved road into a dark dead-end dock just because they missed a turn, Leo. Maybe he was meeting someone, Rossi suggested, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the desk. A guy with a big score doesn't meet his creditors in a brightly lit diner. He goes down to the docks where nobody's watching. Maybe his new partner got tired of sharing the pot. Do you have any idea who that partner might be? If I knew that, Harry, I wouldn't be sitting down here listening to you complain about the weather, Rossi said. He crushed his cigarette in a heavy glass ashtray with deliberate finality. Check the lowlifes on the waterfront. Check the guys who deal in things bigger than $500 bookie tabs. Artie was playing in a puddle way over his head. Sooner or later he stepped into the deep end. I stood, shaking the match. The smoke from my cigarette curled lazily toward the bulb. Appreciate the chat, Leo, I said. Rossi didn't stand. He picked his silver pocket knife back up and went back to filing his nail, his eyes fixed on the small blade. Tell Mac down at the precinct that if he keeps sending you down here to waste my afternoon, I'm going to start billing him for the upholstery. Frankie stepped out from the shadows near the door, his thick frame blocking the exit until I moved past him. I pulled my collar up, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped back out into the cold Seattle rain. The city impound yard on 4th Avenue was a graveyard for crushed metal and bad luck. Acres of chain-link fence topped with barbed wire held rows of smashed sedans, burned-out delivery trucks, and cars that looked like they had been through a meat grinder. The rain beat a steady, depressing tattoo against the rusted roofs of the abandoned wrecks, turning the gravel underfoot into a slick soup of gray mud and oil. I flashed Mac's signed pink slip at the night watchman, a toothless old coot wrapped in a wool blanket who looked like he had been dead for 3 days and just hadn't stopped breathing yet. He barely glanced at the paper, grunted something unintelligible, and pointed a crooked finger toward the far dark corner of the yard. "Road 12, the old man rasped, pulling his blanket tighter. "Watch out for watchdogs. They ain't friendly, and neither am I." Road 12 was at the dead end of the lot, squeezed between a delivery van missing its rear axle and a Buick that had rolled over twice. Sitting right there in the middle was Emerald City Cab's unit number 42, a 1946 Plymouth sedan painted faded yellow, its roof streaked with soot and rainwater. I pulled my coat tight against the wind, stepped carefully over a rusted bumper, and stopped beside the driver's side door. The window was rolled down halfway, just the way the harbor patrol had left it when they found the body. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a clean handkerchief, and wrapped it around my fingers before pulling the exterior handle. The door groaned on its hinges, letting out a heavy puff of stale air that smelled like damp wool, cheap tobacco, and the faint, coppery scent of dried blood that time couldn't quite wash away. I climbed inside, pulling my legs in behind me. The front seat was cramped, the stuffing poking through a tear in the brown imitation leather upholstery. I sat very still for a moment, listening to the rain drumming against the tin roof overhead. It was easy to picture Artie Doyle sitting right here, gripping the steering wheel while someone leaned over the back seat or sat right beside him in the passenger spot. I haven't touched the steering wheel yet. I started with the dashboard. The ignition key was gone, just like Max said, but the metal toggle switch was flipped hard to the right, stuck in the on position. Below it, the taximeter sat bolted to the floorboard, its mechanical numbers frozen in place, $12.50. A fortune in mileage for a city like Seattle, unless the car hadn't been moving at all while the gears kept turning. I leaned over the center bench, shining a small penlight across the rubber floor mats. The driver's side mat was caked in the usual grime of the city, mud, cigarette ash, and grit. But as I shifted the beam to the passenger side, something caught my eye. A thick reddish-brown clump of dried mud was smashed deep into the grooves of the rubber floor mat, right where a passenger's boots would rest. I leaned closer, squinting in the dim light of the penlight. It wasn't standard city street sludge. It had a heavy, distinct iron-rich hue to it, the kind of coarse red industrial clay you only found down at the active shipping yards along the waterfront, where the heavy earth had been dredged up for dry dock construction. I reached down with a gloved finger and brushed a tiny flake of it loose. It felt gritty, dry, and distinctly out of place for a hack driver who spent his nights rolling down paved asphalt. I straightened up, sliding across the worn bench seat to check the glove compartment. I popped the latch. It dropped open with a dull clatter, spilling its contents onto the passenger floorboard. Old toll receipts, a pack of matches from a diner that had gone out of business 2 years ago, a spare tube of tire patches, and a crumpled envelope with no return address. I picked through the debris one by one, moving with slow, deliberate care. Nothing in the receipts looked special, just routine fares across downtown and up toward Queen Anne. Then my fingers brushed against something small and square wedged deep in the narrow crease between the glove box door and the wooden dashboard frame. It was jammed in tight, like someone had tried to shove it out of sight in a hurry. I hooked my fingernail around the edge and pulled it free. It was a matchbook, heavy cardstock, dark maroon with gold lettering embossed across the cover. I flipped it open under the pale beam of my penlight. 3 matches were gone, leaving 4 matches standing in a row. Printed on the inside flap was the name and address, The Velvet Lounge, Private Members and Spirits, Waterfront Way. I flipped the matchbook in my hand. The Velvet Lounge wasn't some rundown hole-in-the-wall dive where cab drivers spent their spare nickels drinking rot-gut whiskey. It was an exclusive high-end club down by the piers, a place where politicians, wealthy industrialists, and high-rolling syndicate men went to burn through cash they didn't report to the taxman. A guy like Artie Doyle wouldn't be caught dead in a joint like that unless he was dropping off a very expensive package, or leaning on someone who owned the building. I slipped the matchbook carefully into my breast pocket, right next to my heart, where it felt heavy and cold against my ribs. I sat back in the driver's seat and looked out the rain-streaked windshield. The impound yard stretched out before me like a row of broken teeth in the dark. The pieces were starting to drift together, but they didn't make a clean picture yet. A dead bookie, a running meter that never went anywhere, red industrial clay on the floor mat, and a matchbook from a club that cost more to enter than I made in a week. I pulled a cigarette from my coat, unlit, and chewed on the filter as I ran the sequence over in my head. Artie hadn't driven himself out to Pier 70 to end his own life. A guy doesn't worry about where he's leaving his car keys or running his gas tank bone dry if he's holding a gun to his own chest. Someone had been in this car with him. Someone whose boots carried red clay from the shipyards, and whose pockets carried matches from the most exclusive lounge in the city. I pushed the car door open, the rusty hinges screeching against the wind, and stepped back out into the freezing rain. The water hit my face like a bucket of cold gravel, washing away the smell of copper and stale tobacco. I pulled my hat down low over my eyes and walked out of the impound yard, leaving the yellow cab alone in the dark. The rain outside the diner window was turning into a gray slush, sliding down the glass in long, lazy tears. Inside, the air smelled like scorched coffee beans, fried grease, and the kind of damp wool that sticks to your ribs. I sat in a corner booth near the back, a chipped white mug of black coffee cooling between my hands. Across from me sat Evelyn Doyle. She wasn't drinking. She had a clean glass of water sitting untouched by her napkin, her fingers laced tightly together on the Formica table. Her eyes looked sharper than they had back in my office, honed down to a fine, dangerous edge. "You look like a man who found something he didn't want to see," she said, her voice dropping beneath the clatter of a fork hitting a plate at the counter. "I found a cab," I told her, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "Row 12 down at the 4th Avenue yard. The cops missed a few things, Mrs. Doyle, or maybe they just didn't care enough to look." "Did you find proof?" she asked, leaning in half an inch. "Is it murder?" "It's a lot of things," I said, setting the mug down. "Start with the timeline the police put in their official report. Mac told me they found Artie's body at 11:45 at night out at Pier 70. The engine was dead, the gas tank was bone dry, and the meter was still clicked to $12.50. Evelyn frowned, her brow tightening. $12.50? That's a long ride. Where does a cabbie make that kind of fare at midnight? Nowhere in Seattle, unless he's driving from the city limits down to Tacoma, I said. And even then, the math doesn't walk straight. Let's look at the numbers, Evelyn. At current city meter rates, $12.50 means the cab was running with passengers for roughly 2 hours of solid transit time. 2 solid hours of wheels turning on asphalt. So he drove a long fare, she said, her tone defensive. Maybe some high roller wanted a late-night tour of the waterfront. Except for one tiny detail, I replied, leaning across the table toward her. The odometer in Artie's hack only logged 6 miles from his last recorded dispatch downtown to the spot where they pulled him out of the water. 6 miles, that's a 10-minute drive, 15 if you hit every red light between here and the docks. Evelyn stopped, her fingers unclasped and flattened against the table. Her eyes blinked once, slow and hard. 6 miles, she repeated, tasting the words. For a $12 meter? A $12 meter on a 6-mile trip is a mathematical impossibility, I said, my voice dropping into a low, steady rumble. A car doesn't rack up 2 hours of fare time while moving 6 miles, unless it isn't moving at all. That engine was burning gas while the car sat parked in one spot for over an hour. The meter kept ticking because nobody reached over to flip the flag back down. He was parked, she whispered, the pieces clicking together behind her sharp eyes. Someone drove him out there, parked the cab at the dead end of Pier 70, left the engine running, and just let it burn itself out until the tank went dry. Bingo, I said. The cops thought Artie drove himself out there, shot himself, and let the car idle. But a dying man doesn't sit in a parked car for 90 minutes watching the meter tick before he kicks the bucket. The timeline the 3rd Precinct is selling to the public is a fairy tale. Artie was dead hours before midnight. Someone else brought that car to the pier to make it look like a late-night tragedy. She looked away, staring out the streaked window at the gray Seattle drizzle. For a second, the hard defensive shell around her cracked just enough to show the gears turning inside her head. She wasn't thinking about Artie's soul or mourning the wedding vows they broke 3 years ago. She was calculating the insurance payout. She was figuring out how clean the murder looked once the math stopped lying. "If the time of death is wrong," Evelyn said, her voice turning cold and sharp again, "then the police report is garbage. The insurance company won't have a leg to stand on if we prove he was murdered hours before they found him." "That's right," I said. "The official suicide theory depends entirely on Artie driving himself out to that pier late at night. Knock out that timeline, and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. The cops will have to open a homicide investigation." "Then do it," she said, sliding her hand across the table and pushing a small folded slip of paper toward my coffee mug. "Tear their report apart, Mr. Nile. Get me the paper I'm paying for." I picked up the paper and tucked it into my vest pocket without opening it. I didn't need to look. I knew what it represented. "I'm not finished pulling at the threads yet," I told her, finishing the last swallow of my cold coffee. Artie wasn't just driving cabs to pay for gas. He was keeping a ledger. And when you play poker with guys like Leo Rossi, you don't get killed over a $500 bar tab. You get killed because you know something you shouldn't. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, standing up from the booth with a sharp, fluid motion. She didn't say goodbye. She just looked down at me with those cold, calculating eyes, turned on her heel, and walked out into the wet Seattle morning, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the linoleum until the diner door swung shut behind her. I sat there in the booth alone, staring at the empty coffee cup, listening to the rain beat a slow, heavy pulse against the glass. The math didn't lie, but whoever had engineered that fake ride down to Pier 70 had made one hell of a messy mistake. The precinct smelled worse than usual by afternoon. The radiator in the corner was hissing like an angry snake, leaking a thin line of rust across the floorboards, while pumping out dry heat that didn't do a damn thing for the chill in my bones. I walked past the holding cells without looking at the drunks, pushed open the slatted wooden gate into the back squad room, and found Mac sitting at his metal desk. He had a greasy paper bag from the deli across the street propped open between his elbows. A half-eaten pastrami sandwich on rye was sitting on a napkin, dripping yellow mustard onto a pile of traffic citations. "You look like a man who just swallowed a bad oyster, Harry," Mac drawled, not looking up as he took a heavy bite of the sandwich. He chewed slowly, his jaw working the rye bread like a man grinding gravel. "What did you do this time? Did Rossi throw you out of his basement, or did the impound watchman try to set his dog on you?" "Neither," I said, pulling up a steel-framed chair and dropping my wet hat onto his desk blotter. Though the watchman looked like he was about 5 minutes away from needing a coroner instead of a blanket. Mac swallowed, washed it down with a lukewarm sip of coffee from a tin cup, and wiped his mouth with the back of his thick hand. "Get to the point, Nile. I'm on lunch break, which means I've got about 3 minutes before the captain comes out of his office screaming about missing paperwork." "I checked the cab," I said, keeping my voice low so the other desk sergeants out in the bullpen wouldn't tune in. "The odometer and the meter don't match up, Mac. You know it, I know it, and the murder boys know it too. That car sat idling at Pier 70 for over an hour while the meter kept ticking. Artie didn't drive himself out there at midnight to punch his own ticket." Mac stopped mid-reach for another bite of his pastrami. His thick hand hovered over the bag. He slowly pulled his hand back, leaned his heavy chair back against the green metal filing cabinet, and let out a long wheezing sigh that stirred the dust motes hanging in the air above his desk. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure that simple bit of arithmetic out," Mac muttered, shaking his head. "You detectives think you're the only ones who can read a dial. If the homicide boys knew the car sat parked, why is the captain still stamping it suicide?" I asked. "Because the captain likes a clean desk," Mac said bluntly. "He likes files that close themselves without a court battle. You start digging into fake timelines, you open up a whole barrel of worms that leads straight back to the waterfront syndicates and big-money political donors. Nobody up on the top floor wants to explain to the city council why a cab driver was executed and left out on a municipal pier. So you buried the math." "I didn't bury anything," Max snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh warning growl. "I just follow orders and type the reports I'm handed. But since you're wandering around breaking into impound lots like a cheap second-story man, I might as well throw you a bone before you get yourself tossed into the bay with concrete overshoes." Mac leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the desk, dangerously close to the mustard spill. "Vice raided Artie Doyle's rooming house apartment yesterday afternoon," Mac said softly. "Down on Yesler Way, tiny little hole in the wall above a laundry. They didn't find much, some dirty socks, an empty bottle of gin, and a stack of old racing forms." "And?" I prompted. "And when they pulled up the linoleum floorboards near the corner of the small kitchenette, they found a loose panel," Mac drawled, his eyes fixed steadily on mine. "Inside was a locked metal cash box. Vice busted the latch with a tire iron. They didn't find cash. They found a black leather ledger book." My posture stiffened. "A ledger, a neat little book," Mac nodded. "Every page is filled with neat columns of figures, dates and initials, names of men who don't usually ride in yellow cabs, tracking payouts made every Friday night for the last 6 months." "Mel, did you see the names?" I asked. "I saw enough," Mac said. "Most of them were small-time bookies and district runners, but right there near the back page, underlined twice in red ink, were a set of initials, MT. MT, I repeated, letting the letters settle on my tongue. "Any relation to a shipyard?" Mac raised an eyebrow. "Now, how would you guess a thing like that?" "Just a hunch. Seattle's a big town, but it only has one set of docks that brings in enough steel to fund a syndicate." "Marcus Thorne," Mac said, confirming it without blinking. "Owner of Thorne Maritime and Dry Dock down on Harbor Island, multi-millionaire, big contributor to the mayor's re-election fund, guy who rubs elbows with state senators and drinks scotch out of crystal glasses at private clubs." "And what was Artie Doyle's connection to a high society shipbuilder?" I asked. "Extortion," Mac said simply. "According to the notes in that ledger, Artie somehow got his hands on documents proving Thorne's shipyard was cutting corners on federal government contracts, substituting cheap, substandard steel for naval destroyers and pocketing the difference on the invoice balance. Artie wasn't a bookie anymore, he was a blackmailer. That's a heavy game for a guy who couldn't pay a $500 bar tab to Leo Rossi," I said. "Desperation makes men do stupid things," Mac replied, picking up his pastrami sandwich again. "Artie figured he hit the jackpot. He thought he could milk Thorne for a steady weekly cut. But guys like Marcus Thorne don't pay protection money to cab drivers forever. Sooner or later they cut the line." "Where is the ledger now?" I asked. "In the evidence locker upstairs under lock and key," Mac said. "And the Vice Squad handed copies of the pages directly to the captain. Which means if you go waving your nose around Thorne's shipyard asking about steel shipments, the captain won't just pull your private investigator license. He'll have you arrested for interfering with an official municipal investigation." I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the dark imported cigar I had been saving for a rainy afternoon, and laid it gently across the edge of Mac's pastrami bag. Mac looked down at the cigar, then slowly looked back up at me. A wry, tired smile touched his lips. "You never quit, do you, Harry?" "Bills keep coming in, Mac," I said, standing up from the chair and grabbing my wet hat off the desk. "And funerals cost more than they used to." "Stay away from Harbor Island, Harry," Mac warned quietly, slipping the cigar into his shirt pocket. "Thorne has private security guards with shotguns, who don't care about pink impound slips or private investigator licenses. If you go poking around his dry docks, you won't need a cab to get to Pier 70. You'll already be floating." I didn't answer him. I just pulled my hat down low over my eyes, turned my back on the bullpen, and walked out into the gray Seattle afternoon. The pieces were falling into place, heavy and cold as iron, and Marcus Thorne was sitting right at the center of the web. The office was pitch black when I walked back in, save for the sickly yellow neon glow bleeding through the frosted glass from the hotel sign across the street. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I didn't want to see the peeling paint on the walls or the dust motes dancing in the stale air. I just dropped my wet hat onto the corner of the desk, pulled out my chair, and sat down in the dark. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the matchbook I'd pried from the dash of Artie Doyle's cab back at the 4th Avenue impound yard. I flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. 3 matches gone, 4 left standing in a neat row, like little wooden soldiers, waiting for a war they weren't smart enough to avoid. I traced my thumb over the gold-embossed lettering on the cover. The Velvet Lounge, Private Members and Spirits, Waterfront Way. Mac had laid it all out for me down at the precinct. Marcus Thorne, millionaire shipbuilder, pillar of the Seattle business community, and the man whose initials sat underlined twice in red ink inside Artie's hidden floorboard ledger. Artie had been bleeding him for cash, squeezing a high society titan over substandard steel shipments meant for naval contracts. But blackmail is a dangerous game when you're playing against a guy who can afford to buy a precinct full of captains. I pulled a fresh cigarette from my pack, struck a match from the very matchbook I was examining, and held the flame to the tip. The sulfur flared bright and hot in the dim room, casting long, jittery shadows across the walls before I shook it out and tossed the burnt stick into the glass ashtray. The matchbook wasn't just a clue, it was a bridge. Artie didn't drop that matchbook by accident. Cab drivers don't carry high-end club matches in their pockets, unless they've been sitting inside the velvet-lined booths talking terms with the men who own the joint. Artie had gone down to the Velvet Lounge to shake down Thorne face to face, or perhaps to collect a weekly payoff that finally ran out of road. And somewhere between that private club and the dead-end planks of Pier 70, Artie's luck had run entirely out. I sat there in silence, watching the cigarette smoke curl up toward the ceiling tiles, listening to the rain beat a steady rhythmic pulse against the glass pane. My mind went back to the impound yard. The meter read $12.50, the odometer locked at 6 miles. The car idled on the dark pier while the engine burned through every last drop of gas in the tank. Thorne hadn't just paid someone to get rid of a blackmailer. Thorne had engineered the whole thing himself. He had taken control of the hack, driven it out to the water, and left it there to rot while he built an airtight alibi. And how do you build an airtight alibi when you're committing murder across town at midnight? You make sure you're seen somewhere else entirely, somewhere exclusive, somewhere high class, where the bartenders remember every rich guy who walks through the door, and the cops don't ask uncomfortable questions. Like a private club on Waterfront Way. I pulled the telephone directory out from beneath a stack of old case files on my desk. The paper was thin and yellowed at the edges. I flipped the pages quickly under the faint neon glow until I hit the commercial listings. Thorne Maritime, Velvet Lounge. There it was. The Velvet Lounge, Private Members Club, 410 Waterfront Way. Listed under Thorne Enterprises Direct Corporate Holding. Marcus Thorne didn't just hang out at the Velvet Lounge. He owned it. It was his private playground, his back alley boardroom where deals were struck away from the prying eyes of newspaper reporters and union organizers. If Artie went down there to squeeze him for more cash, Thorne wouldn't have to look far for a quiet corner to hand over the money or a quiet way to end the problem permanently. I tapped the ash off my cigarette into the glass tray. The pieces were locking into place with the mechanical precision of a safe tumbler falling home. The blackmailer, the empty gas tank, the fake timeline, the high-end matchbook wedged into the dashboard. Every single thread pointed straight to the polished mahogany doors of the Velvet Lounge. The problem was what came next. If I walked into the Velvet Lounge wearing my rumpled suit and carrying my questions, Thorne's private security guards wouldn't even let me pass the coat check. And if I went back to Mac with just a matchbook and a theory, the captain would laugh me out of the squad room before tearing up my license for good. I needed proof, hard, physical proof that tied Thorne directly to the inside of that yellow Plymouth cab on the night of the murder. I reached down and picked up the red industrial clay flake I had scraped from the passenger floor mat back at the impound yard, wrapped neatly in a small piece of tissue paper on my desk. I rolled it between my thumb and forefinger. Coarse, iron-rich earth. The exact kind of dirt you only kicked up walking around an active shipyard dry dock under construction. If Thorne had driven Artie's cab from the shipyard out to Pier 70 that night, his shoes would have carried that exact red clay right into the vehicle. And if he was wearing those same expensive leather boots tonight while pouring scotch at his private club, I might just be able to catch him with his guard down. I rose from my desk, floorboards groaning under my boots. I stubbed out my cigarette in the tray, picked up my wet fedora, and jammed it down firmly on my head. It was time to crash high society. I reached inside my coat pocket, making sure my revolver was seated comfortably in its shoulder holster, and stepped out into the dark, rain-soaked hallway. The night was cold, the streets were slick, and a wealthy shipbuilder was about to find out how much a $12 cab ride really cost. The transition from the wet, miserable gutters of Seattle to the interior of the Velvet Lounge felt like walking out of a sewer and right into a bank vault. The club sat back from Waterfront Way behind a heavy facade of polished black granite and dark oak panels. There was no neon sign blinking out front, just a discreet brass plaque carved with the silhouette of a martini glass and 2 quiet words, "The Velvet Lounge." A burly doorman in a tailored wool overcoat stood beside the double doors, eyeing my rumpled suit with the kind of practiced disdain usually reserved for stray dogs tracking mud across a clean Persian rug. I didn't give him time to ask for a membership card. I slipped my hand inside my coat, flashed the edge of a silver police surplus badge holder I'd picked up off a dead tip years ago, and walked past him before he could process the metal. "Private insurance inquiry," I muttered, keeping my voice low and authoritative as I shouldered through the heavy oak doors. "Step aside, friend." The interior hit me like a slap of warm velvet and expensive cologne. The room was bathed in low amber light filtering down from heavy iron chandeliers. Thick crimson carpet swallowed the sound of footsteps completely. Along the far wall, a mahogany bar stretched 20 feet, polished to a mirror shine that reflected rows of crystal decanters filled with golden liquor. A live piano player in the corner was quietly murdering a Gershwin tune, his notes getting lost beneath the low murmur of wealthy men in bespoke suits and women dripping with genuine diamonds. It was a sanctuary for people who didn't lose sleep over bills or police reports. I didn't linger near the entrance. I kept my hands tucked in my coat pockets, threading my way through the clusters of tables until I spotted him sitting in a high-backed booth tucked into the far corner shadows. Marcus Thorne. He looked exactly like his press clippings in the morning paper. Early 40s, sharp jawline, silver-streaked dark hair combed back with military precision. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit him like a second skin, a silk tie held down by a gold pin, and a crystal tumbler of scotch resting between his fingers. He was leaning back against the red leather upholstery, laughing softly at something a younger woman in a green satin dress was whispering in his ear. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked straight up to the booth, planted my hand on the polished wooden edge of the table, and dropped uninvited into the empty leather seat directly across from him. Thorne's laughter died instantly. The woman beside him blinked, her eyebrows arching in sharp offense as she pulled back. Thorne didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed into 2 cold, hard slits as he took me in, from the wet brim of my fedora down to the mud-stained cuffs of my trousers. "I believe you're sitting at a private table, mister," Thorne said, his voice smooth and controlled, carrying the rich baritone of a man who was used to people clearing out the room the moment he raised an eyebrow. "Sorry to crash the party, mister." "Thorne," I said, keeping my tone flat and conversational. "Name's Nile, private inquiry. I'd buy you a drink to smooth things over, but I figured you've already got enough liquid assets on the table." Thorne set his crystal glass on a linen coaster. The ice cube inside clinked against the rim like a small hammer striking lead. He didn't look rattled, but the muscles along his jaw tightened just a fraction. "I don't know any Niles," Thorne said quietly, waving a dismissive hand at the woman in green. "Run along, Claire. The gentleman and I need to discuss business." Claire didn't need to be told twice. She scooped up her velvet evening bag and hurried off toward the bar without looking back. When she was gone, Thorne leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He smelled like expensive pipe tobacco, cedar, and high-end scotch. "You've got about 30 seconds to explain why a gumshoe in a wet rag of a suit thinks he can sit at my table before I have the doorman throw you out into the bay, Mr. Nile." "It's a small town, Marcus," I said, leaning back into the shadows of the booth so he had to work to read my face. "Stories get around. People talking about shipyard contracts, substandard steel, and dead bookies found parked at Pier 70 with empty gas tanks." If the name Arthur Doyle or the reference to Pier 70 hit a nerve, Thorne didn't show it on his skin. His breathing didn't hitch. His pulse didn't jump in the hollow of his throat. He just picked up his glass again, took a slow, measured sip of the amber liquid, and set it back down. "A man gets into gambling debts. He makes poor choices," Thorne said smoothly, his voice dropping an octave. "Sometimes those choices catch up with him at the end of a dark pier. It's a tragedy for his family, no doubt. But I build ships for the United States Navy, Mr. Nile. I don't keep track of every low-level bookie who wanders through the waterfront districts. Except for the ones who keep ledgers under their floorboards," I countered softly. That made him pause. The glass stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, the polished mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating calculator underneath. "Police departments are full of leaking buckets these days," Thorne murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with lethal intensity. A smart man learns early on not to trust everything he reads on a police blotter, or everything a desperate private eye tries to sell to a grand jury. I'm not selling anything yet, I told him, keeping my eyes steady. I'm just observing the local scenery. Then you've seen enough, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a quiet, icy command. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight in his tone could have crushed a boulder. Finish your drink, or don't, and walk out those front doors. Because if I see your face anywhere near my dry docks or my clubs again, you won't be writing case files from a dark office. You'll be joining Mr. Doyle at the bottom of the Sound. I didn't blink. I let the silence stretch between us for 3 long beats, listening to the piano player pound out another melancholy chord across the room. And then, as Thorne shifted his weight to signal the bouncer standing by the bar, my eyes dropped down from his face. I looked past the edge of the table, down to the floor where his long legs were crossed. He was wearing custom-made black calfskin Oxfords, polished to a high mirror gloss. But right there along the deep welt of the left shoe, trapped in the tight decorative stitching near the heel, was a tiny dried crescent of coarse reddish-brown earth, iron-rich clay. The exact same red shipyard dirt I had scraped off the passenger floor mat of Artie Doyle's Plymouth cab earlier that morning. I raised my eyes back up to his, letting a slow, thin smile touch the corners of my mouth. I didn't say a word about filth. I didn't have to. The math was already finished. "Nice shoes, Mr. Thorne," I said softly, standing up from the booth. "It must take a lot of work to keep them clean when you're out walking in the mud late at night." Thorne didn't answer. He just watched me stand, his fingers curling tightly around the stem of his crystal glass until his knuckles turned chalk white. I turned my back on him, walking across the thick crimson carpet toward the front doors. The air outside was freezing and wet, but the chill didn't matter anymore. I had my piece of the puzzle, and the game was just about to run out of road. The rain had turned into a thick, choking fog by midnight, rolling off the salt water of Puget Sound and swallowing the skeleton cranes of the Thorne Maritime Shipyard whole. The massive iron gates were unlocked, left half open like a toothless jaw waiting for a stray dog to wander in. I cut the lights on my sedan a block away, coasting in silence on the damp asphalt until I tucked the hood behind a row of rusted shipping containers. I didn't wait long. 5 minutes after I killed the engine, a sleek black Packard sedan rolled through the front gates, its tires hissing softly against the wet gravel. It pulled up beside the main dry dock office and killed its lights. Marcus Thorne stepped into the fog. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. He had on a heavy wool trench coat pulled tight around his neck, his leather gloves gleaming in the faint amber glow of the security lamps overhead. He checked his wristwatch, looked around the empty yard once with sharp, suspicious eyes, and then pulled a heavy keyring from his pocket to unlock the side metal door of the admin building. I gave him 30 seconds to get inside before I slipped out of my car and moved across the gravel like a ghost. The door was left slightly ajar to let the damp air clear out the stale office smell. I pushed it open with the flat of my hand, stepping over the threshold into the dark, echoing space. Thorne was standing over a drafting table near the back window, holding a small metal flashlight that cut a bright yellow beam across a stack of blue engineering schematics. He heard the floorboard creak under my shoe, froze mid-reach, and spun around with his hand diving straight into the deep pocket of his trench coat. A heavy nickel-plated revolver came out with him, the muzzle leveling right at my chest with cold, practiced precision. "You don't know when to quit, do you, Nile?" Thorne's voice was low and steady, carrying a dangerous, razor-thin edge that could cut glass. Most men would take a hint when they're told to walk away from a private club. I stopped 10 feet away, keeping my hands resting loosely at my sides, clear of my coat. I didn't look at the gun. I looked straight into his eyes. "Most men don't have $50 retainers riding on the outcome, Marcus," I said, letting a dry, cynical edge slip into my tone. "And besides, I hate leaving a math problem half-solved." Thorne's finger tightened slightly on the trigger guard. "You're standing in a private industrial yard at midnight, trespassing on federal contract property. If I pull this trigger, the night watchman will drag your body into the bay, and the police will write you off as another drifter who fell off the docks. Nobody will look twice. Except they'd have to explain how a drifter got a bullet hole that matches the one in Artie Doyle's chest," I shot back, my voice flat and unyielding. Thorne didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. Artie Doyle killed himself. The police report is filed, signed and closed. That's where you made your first big mistake, Marcus, I said, taking half a step closer. You thought because the 3rd Precinct captain wanted a clean desk, the rest of the world was going to swallow that fairy tale. But a dead bookie doesn't drive his own car out to Pier 70, sit behind the wheel for 90 minutes with the engine idling, let the gas tank run bone dry, and then throw his own gun into the bay where nobody can find it. Thorne didn't speak. He just kept the gun steady, watching me like a hawk sizing up a rabbit. Let's walk through the math you messed up, I told him, holding up a finger. Artie came down to your club, or cornered you somewhere else earlier that night. He had the ledger. He had the proof that your shipyard was substituting cheap, substandard steel on Navy destroyer contracts and pocketing the government payout. He wanted a bigger piece of the pie. He thought he had you over a barrel. He was a parasite, Thorne spat out, the venom finally breaking through his smooth corporate facade. A low-life bookie trying to squeeze a lifetime of protection money out of an honest business. So you agreed to pay him, I continued, pressing the sequence home. You told him to meet you down near the edge of the shipyard around 9 o'clock. You got into his cab to talk terms in private. But instead of cutting a check, you pulled a piece from your pocket and put a bullet right through his ribs while he sat in the driver's seat. Thorne's jaw tightened. You have zero proof of that. I have the floor mat, I said clearly. And I have your boots. Thorne's gaze dropped downward for a split second, just a fraction of an inch toward the floor. It was all the confirmation I needed. Artie was dead in the front seat, I said, laying out the true sequence piece by piece. And you realized you had a massive problem. You couldn't leave his body parked right here inside your active shipyard. That brings federal investigators down on your contracts before the sun comes up. You had to move the car, so you climbed behind the steering wheel yourself. Keep talking, detective, Thorne muttered, the hammer of the revolver clicking back another notch with a sharp metallic sound. You drove his cab yourself all the way out to the dead end of Pier 70, I said, my voice rising slightly over the sound of the fog rolling against the warehouse windows. You parked it at the water's edge. But you couldn't just walk away immediately. If you left the car cold, the time of death would point straight back to 9 o'clock, right when you were seen at your shipyard. So you left the key switched to the on position, left the taximeter running to fake a 2-hour transit time, and let the engine idle until it burned through the last drop of gas in the tank. That's why the meter said 1250, while the odometer only logged 6 miles. You engineered a fake timeline to give yourself an airtight alibi at the Velvet Lounge. The silence in the dark office was heavy enough to choke. The only sound was the distant lapping of the dark water against the wooden pilings outside. You drove that cab, Marcus, I said, pointing straight down at the polished leather of his shoes. And when you climbed out of the driver's seat and stepped onto the floor mat, your expensive shoes picked up a clump of coarse, red iron-rich industrial clay, the exact same earth dug up from this dry dock under construction. You left that clay smeared right on the rubber mat of Artie's cab. And you carried a trace of it right into the crimson carpet of your own club. Thorne stared at me. The gun stayed level, but his hand was no longer rock solid. A fine tremor had started in his wrist. The intellectual arrogance of a man who thought he could outsmart the city was finally colliding with the cold, hard geometry of physical evidence. You're a very observant man, Mr. Nile, Thorne whispered, his voice dangerously low. Too observant for your own health. The trouble with framing a murder as a suicide, Marcus, I told him, taking another slow step forward, is that the math never quite balances out in the end, and the meter always keeps running until the tank goes dry. The hammer of Marcus Thorne's silver-plated revolver clicked back all the way, locking into place with a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the metal drafting tables. In a small, dark room at midnight, a gun doesn't look like a tool. It looks like an absolute end to conversation. You figured out the math, Harry, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a low, dead hum that didn't sound like a corporate executive anymore. It sounded like a man who had already crossed the line and was just figuring out where to bury the boots. I'll give you that. Most guys with a badge or a cheap license would have taken the precinct suicide note and gone home to sleep it off, but you had to keep turning the dials. It's a bad habit, I told him, keeping my voice steady, my hands loose near my sides. I never did like loose threads. They tend to trip a guy up when he's walking down a dark alley. You won't be walking down any alleys after tonight, Thorne said, his grip tightening around the checkered walnut grip of the pistol. The steel we use on those Navy contracts isn't substandard, Nile. It meets every federal stress test on paper because we pay the inspectors enough to look at the ceiling while they sign the forms. Artie Doyle was a parasite who figured out how to read the shipping manifests, and he thought he could bleed my company dry 50 grand at a time. He didn't deserve a trial. He deserved a hole in the water. And you thought you could buy a clean slate by parking his hack out at Pier 70, I said. I built this city, Thorne snapped, a sudden flash of raw fury breaking through his polished veneer. Generations of men built these shipyards, and I'm not going to let some two-bit bookie with a dirty ledger bring down multi-million-dollar federal contracts just because he wanted to finance his horse race bets. I drove that cab, I parked it, and I threw his gun so far out into the Puget Sound that the tide will never spit it back up. Nobody saw me. Nobody knows, except you and Mac down at the precinct. I lied smoothly, betting a heavy stack on a pair of deuces. The ledger is locked in the evidence room, Marcus. Even if you put a hole in me right now, that book has your initials underlined twice in red ink. The moment I don't check back in by morning, Mac pulls the file and hands it straight to federal marshals. You aren't burying this case. You're just giving it a louder megaphone. For a split second, Thorne's eyes flickered. The lie hit home, a tiny crack in his armor. That microsecond of hesitation was all the room I needed. I didn't reach for my shoulder holster. If I tried to clear leather, a .45 caliber slug would have torn right through my ribs before my hand hit the grip. Instead, I threw my weight forward, sweeping my left hand across the drafting table and sending a heavy wooden tray of brass architectural scales and metal drafting triangles crashing directly across the surface. The clatter was deafening in the small office. Thorne flinched instinctively, his eyes darting toward the noise, and his gun hand jerked half an inch to the left. I slammed into him before he could correct the aim. My shoulder caught him square in the chest, driving his back hard against the metal filing cabinets behind the table. The impact knocked the wind out of him with a sharp, wet gasp. The revolver went flying from his hand, clattering across the concrete floor and sliding under a metal desk in the corner. "You son of a..." Thorne wheezed, swinging a heavy right fist that grazed my jawline and sent a hot flash of pain shooting up through my cheek. I didn't give him room to recover. I grabbed the lapels of his expensive wool coat, hauled him forward, and drove my knee up hard into his stomach. He doubled over with a muffled groan, his knees buckling beneath him as the last of his breath left his lungs in a rush. I shoved him back. He tripped over the edge of an open blueprint drawer and went down hard onto the concrete floor, sprawling out among the scattered drafting pencils and technical schematics. I stood over him, breathing heavily, rubbing my sore jaw with the back of my hand. Thorne lay on his side, clutching his stomach, his expensive silver-streaked hair matted with sweat against his forehead, his custom suit wrinkled and stained with industrial dust. The invincible shipbuilder didn't look so grand anymore. He just looked like a man who had finally run out of credit. I walked over to the corner desk, dropped to one knee, and fished the nickel-plated revolver out from underneath the metal frame. I checked the cylinder, flipped the safety catch on, and slipped the heavy piece securely into my own coat pocket. Then I walked back over to where Thorne was slowly pushing himself up onto his elbows, gasping for air. "Stay right there, Marcus," I told him, pulling my notebook from my vest pocket and tearing off a blank page with my pen. "Don't try to stand up, and don't reach for any more guns. We're going to wait right here until my friend Mac and a squad car pull through those front gates." Thorne looked up at me from the floor, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated hatred. Blood was trickling from a small scratch on his cheek where he'd hit the concrete. "You think the police are going to lock me up, Nile?" he rasped, coughing as he tried to catch his breath. "The mayor eats dinner at my club. The police chief is on my board of directors. You don't have a case. You have a battered opinion and a dead man's matchbook." "You forgot one thing, Marcus," I said, looking down at him with a cold, flat stare. "What's that?" he snarled. "The math," I told him, pulling out my cigarette case and flipping it open with my thumb. "The meter always keeps running until the tank goes dry." Outside in the wet fog, the faint, rising wail of a police siren began to cut through the night air, growing louder with every second as it turned off Waterfront Way and headed straight for the shipyard gates. The rain was finally letting up by dawn, turning from a driving sheet into a thick, miserable mist that clung to the windows of my office like a wet wool blanket. I sat behind my desk with a half-empty glass of bourbon, listening to the morning traffic rumble past on the street below. The case was officially wrapped. Down at the 3rd Precinct, Marcus Thorne was sitting in a holding cell waiting for a judge who wasn't going to offer him bail, while his high-priced lawyers frantically tried to explain away a ledger filled with blackmail notes, substandard steel contracts, and the heavy physical trail of red shipyard clay. The suicide ruling had been quietly dumped into the shredder, replaced by a neat, blood-stained homicide file that even the captain couldn't sweep under the carpet. The door pushed open with a familiar dry squeak, and Evelyn Doyle stepped into the room. She didn't wear a trench coat this time. She wore a sharp, tailored black wool suit that looked like it had been bought with an advance on a very specific $5,000 insurance check. Her makeup was immaculate, her hair pinned back in clean, sharp lines, and her eyes carried the cool, satisfied glitter of a woman who had just won a high-stakes hand of poker. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight across the room, planted her handbag on the edge of my scarred wooden desk, and looked down at me. "I just came from the insurance office, Mr. Nile," she said, her voice smooth and even. "The claims adjuster received an updated copy of the police report from Sergeant McAllister about an hour ago. They're releasing the check. I'm glad to hear the paperwork finally caught up with reality, Mrs. Doyle," I said, leaning back in my squeaking chair and swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "You did good work," she said, opening her bag and pulling out a crisp, thick envelope. She slid it across the wood until it rested against my notepad. $50 balance, as agreed, plus a little extra for your trouble." I didn't touch the envelope right away. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the cheap burn settle in my chest. Artie got a proper murder investigation instead of a cheap burial in the archives. You got your $5,000 to clear your debts and buy a ticket out of this damp town. Everyone walks away with what they came for. Except Artie, she noted with a total lack of sentiment. Artie was playing a game way out of his league, I replied flatly. When you try to squeeze a millionaire shipbuilder who cuts corners on naval steel, you aren't playing for poker chips anymore. Thorne shot him in the driver's seat of his own cab at the shipyard, drove the body down to Pier 70 himself, and left the engine idling to fake a 2-hour transit time that gave him an airtight alibi at his private club. The math was airtight until the gas tank ran dry, and the red clay on his boots left a signature on the floor mat. Evelyn nodded once, her expression unchanging. She didn't ask for the gory details, and she didn't pretend to mourn. She scooped up her bag, turned toward the door, and paused with her hand on the brass knob. "Goodbye, Mr. Nile," she said softly. "If I ever need another problem solved quietly, I'll know where to find the office." She pulled the door open, stepped out into the hallway, and let the latch click shut behind her. I sat there in the quiet room for a long moment, watching the morning light filter through the dirty glass. I reached out, picked up the thick envelope, and tucked it into my desk drawer. It wouldn't solve all my problems, and it wouldn't dry out the rain-soaked streets outside, but it kept the lights on for another month. I poured myself one last finger-width of bourbon, raised the glass to the empty room, and took a drink. The rain in Seattle didn't wash away sins, and it didn't bring back the dead. It just made the pavement slick enough for the next poor bastard to slip on. I set the glass down, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward me, and waited for the next case to walk through the door. Drop a comment below and let me know which clue fooled you first, or subscribe to follow the next case file out of the shadows.